The crash of crystal against marble was the only sound in the cavernous room. Amelia flinched, her hand tightening on the dust cloth. From her position by the grand fireplace, she could see him. Dante Alighieri sat in his wheelchair, a statue of fury carved from granite and tailored silk. His left hand was clenched on the armrest, the knuckles white. His right was still open from the act of throwing the whiskey tumbler. Shards glittered like fallen stars on the black and white checkered floor, a constellation of his rage. She was supposed to be invisible, a ghost in a dark blue dress and white apron who polished silver and erased footprints. His wife, Isabella, had always treated her as such. But Isabella was gone. And now, in the suffocating silence that followed her departure, Amelia was the only other person in the room with the most dangerous man in New York. She could not leave. She had heard the argument, of course. The whole house had. Isabella's voice, sharp and glittering as the diamonds she was packing, had sliced through the heavy stillness of the mansion. "I will not be a nursemaid to a cripple," she had shrieked, her voice echoing in the foyer. "I married a king, not a broken toy." Amelia had kept her head down, polishing a silver frame holding a picture of a younger Dante, a man who stood tall and confident, his arm around a woman who was not Isabella, a ghost from a previous life. Isabella had swept past her then, a storm of expensive perfume and righteous indignation, followed by two of Dante's men hauling her mountain of designer luggage. She did not spare the man in the wheelchair a single glance. The front door had slammed shut, a sound as final as a gunshot. That was an hour ago. Since then, Dante had not moved, except to pour the whiskey, and then to send it flying. He stared at the spot where the glass had shattered, his jaw a line of brutal tension. His stillness was more frightening than any shout. It was the stillness of a predator gathering itself. A predator who could no longer hunt on his own terms. Amelia's instructions were clear. Stay out of the master's way. Do not speak unless spoken to. Her shift was over in 20 minutes. She could just slip out the back, pretend she had not seen the raw, unguarded moment of his humiliation. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. She took a small step back, towards the shadows of the hallway. His voice cut through the silence, low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You." Amelia froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He had not turned. He was still staring at the broken glass. How did he even know she was there? "Get a dustpan," he commanded. The words were not a request. They were an order, absolute and cold. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, sir." Her voice was a mouse's whisper. She scurried from the room, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floors. In the utility closet, her hands trembled as she grabbed the small brush and pan. She was just a maid. A 20-year-old from Queens who was good at cleaning and better at being quiet. This was not her world. These were not her problems. When she returned, he was in the exact same position. She knelt on the cold marble, careful to keep her back to him. The scent of aged whiskey and something else, something sharp and metallic like ozone, hung in the air. She began to sweep the larger shards into the pan. The small, careful scrape of the brush felt obscenely loud. She worked methodically, her focus narrowing to the task. Each piece of crystal was a tiny, sharp danger. She gathered them all, then used a damp cloth from her apron pocket to wipe away the glittering dust, leaving the marble pristine once more. As she worked, she was acutely aware of his presence behind her. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back, on her bent head. It was a physical pressure, heavy and unnerving. She stood, holding the dustpan full of glittering ruin. She did not know what to do next. Should she just leave? Should she ask to be dismissed? "The last one to defy me in this house is dead," he said to the empty space in front of him. His voice was conversational, almost detached, which made it infinitely more terrifying. His name was Antonio. "He thought my father's death made me weak. He was wrong." Amelia's blood went cold. She stood rooted to the spot, the dustpan feeling like a lead weight in her hand. This was not for her. He was talking to himself, or perhaps to the ghost of his wife. She thinks this, he continued, gesturing vaguely with his chin toward the front door. Makes me weak. He finally turned the chair, the quiet whir of the motor a sinister sound in the silent room. He faced her fully now. His eyes, the color of dark, bitter coffee, pinned her in place. They were flat, devoid of emotion, but they saw everything. What do you think, Amelia? He knew her name. The fact struck her with the force of a physical blow. In the 6 months she had worked here, he had never once addressed her by name. She was the maid, or simply an unseen presence. To hear her name on his lips, in that low, dangerous voice, felt like a branding. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. What could she possibly say? His gaze dropped to the dustpan in her hands. You are efficient. You cleaned up the mess without a word. Without fuss, he looked back at her face, his expression unreadable. Isabella would have screamed. Then she would have called someone else to clean it up. Then she would have complained about the noise. He was comparing her to his wife. The thought was so absurd, so far outside the realm of possibility, that it almost made her want to laugh. But the look in his eyes stopped any hint of hysteria. This was not a compliment. It was an observation, a calculation. I am a maid, sir, she said, her voice barely audible.
It is my job.
It is, he agreed. A flicker of something that might have been grim amusement crossed his face before it was gone.
Go.
Your shift is over. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She turned and walked, not ran, from the room. She disposed of the broken glass in the kitchen, her movements stiff and automatic. She hung her apron on its hook, grabbed her purse from a locker, and slipped out the service entrance into the cool evening air. As she walked down the long, manicured driveway toward the bus stop, she could not shake the feeling of his eyes on her. She had thought she was invisible, but he had seen her. And in a house suddenly empty of all loyalty, a quiet, efficient girl who simply did her job had become, somehow, visible. That was the moment her simple life ended. She just did not know it yet. The next week was a study in silence. The mansion, usually humming with Isabella's social engagements and the constant traffic of her friends, was tomb quiet. Dante's men, broad-shouldered and grim-faced, moved through the halls like wraiths, their voices low, their faces set.
They watched Amelia now.
Their gazes were no longer dismissive. They were curious.
Wary.
She was the girl who had been in the room when the king was dethroned. Dante himself was a ghost in his own home. He spent most of his time in his study, the heavy oak doors always closed. Amelia would clean the room in the early morning before he entered it. It smelled of cedar, old books and his cologne, a scent of sandalwood and something faintly smoky. The room was his fortress. A massive desk dominated the space, but he rarely sat at it now. His wheelchair was usually positioned by the large, bulletproof window overlooking the sprawling back lawn and the distant shimmer of the city. One morning, as she was dusting the shelves, Marco, Dante's underboss, entered without knocking. He was a man in his 50s, with a face like a worn map of Sicily and eyes that held a lifetime of secrets. He stopped short when he saw her. He is not here, Marco said. It was not a question.
No, sir.
I am just cleaning, Amelia replied, keeping her eyes down.
Marco grunted.
He walked over to the desk and placed a thin leather-bound folder on it. He looked at it, then at the chair where Dante would soon sit. A deep sigh escaped him. This is a mess. All of it he seemed to be speaking to himself. The vultures are circling. They smell blood. Amelia continued her dusting, pretending she hadn't heard. Rinaldi sent a gift, Marco said, his voice laced with contempt. A wreath. For condolences, he says. Amelia knew the name. The Rinaldi family were Dante's chief rivals. A wreath was not a gift. It was a message. It was a threat. Marco ran a hand over his tired face. Dante needs to make a move. He needs to show them the spine is not broken, only the legs. But he just sits in this room. He looked at Amelia then, a sharp, assessing glance. You were there when she left. I was cleaning the living room. Amelia said quietly. And she left, sir. Marco let out a short, harsh laugh.
She left. Yes.
Took $500,000 in jewelry and whatever was in the safe. A parting gift, he shook his head.
Pride.
It is all he has left, and she took a hammer to it. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Be careful, girl. This house is not safe right now. The warning chilled her more than the silent disapproval of the other men. Marco was not a man who wasted words. Later that day, the truth of his words became terrifyingly clear. Amelia was in the upstairs gallery, replacing wilted flowers in a vase, when she heard the commotion from the front of the house.
Shouts.
A heavy thud, then silence. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She crept to the top of the grand staircase and peered down. Two of Dante's men were dragging an unconscious man in a garish tracksuit out the front door. Another man, his face bleeding from a cut on his cheek, was holding Dante's wheelchair, which was tipped precariously. Dante was gripping the wheels, his face a mask of cold fury, trying to right himself. I told you, boss, let us handle it, the guard was saying, his voice tight with panic. He was not armed. Just a message boy from Rinaldi. Get your hands off my chair, Dante snarled. The venom in his voice made the larger man flinch and pull back. With a grunt of pure, animalistic effort, Dante wrenched the wheels and slammed the chair back onto all fours. But the momentum was too much. The chair spun, and his hand, the one that had been braced on the wheel, was smashed against the marble newel post at the base of the stairs. A sharp, cracking sound echoed in the foyer. Dante did not cry out. He simply stopped, his head bowed, his body rigid. A strangled breath hissed through his teeth. Amelia saw it from the top of the stairs. The unnatural angle of his fingers. The blood that began to well, dark and thick, from between his knuckles. The other guards were busy with the intruder, and the one who had been helping him now stood frozen, terrified of his boss's wrath. No one was moving. No one was helping him. They were all afraid. In that moment, Amelia forgot to be afraid herself. She saw only a man who was hurt, a man trapped and surrounded by people who feared him too much to touch him. She moved without thinking. She flew down the stairs, her practical shoes silent on the marble. She knelt before him, ignoring the stunned looks from the guards. Your hand, she said, her voice soft but firm. Dante's head snapped up. His eyes were blazing with a mixture of pain and incandescent rage. Get away from me. It's broken, she said, her gaze fixed on the mangled fingers. It needs to be set and cleaned. She reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and gently took his wrist. His skin was hot, his pulse thrumming wildly beneath her fingers. He could have broken her arm with a single twist, but he let her touch him. He watched her, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she carefully examined the injury. I need the first aid kit from the kitchen, she said over her shoulder to the nearest guard. And ice.
Now.
The guard, a young man named Paolo, looked from her to Dante, his expression one of utter confusion. Dante said nothing. He just stared at Amelia's small hand holding his bloody, powerful hand that had just been rendered useless. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. Paolo scrambled to obey. Amelia did not wait. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her apron pocket and gently dabbed at the blood, her touch incredibly light. She worked in a small bubble of silence, aware only of the man in front of her, the scent of his skin, the heat of his pain. She had been a nursing student for a year before her mother got sick, and she had to drop out to work. The knowledge came back to her now, clear and precise. She assessed the break, the swelling. Paolo returned with a large medical kit and a bag of ice. Amelia took them without a word. She wrapped the ice in a towel and gently pressed it against his swelling knuckles. Dante hissed in pain but did not pull away. He just watched her, his dark eyes narrowed, tracking her every movement. This will hurt, she said quietly, pulling out splints and bandages. She worked quickly, her hands steady. She aligned the bones with a practiced, gentle pressure. He flinched violently, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he did not stop her. She wrapped his hand, her movements economical and sure, immobilizing the broken fingers. When she was done, she sat back on her heels. The foyer was silent again. The intruder was gone. The guard stood by the door, watching the scene with a sort of awe. She had touched him. She had given him orders, and he had obeyed. Amelia looked up at Dante. The fire in his eyes had banked, replaced by something else. A deep, penetrating curiosity. He flexed his uninjured hand, then looked at the newly bandaged one. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I was in school. For nursing," she answered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I had to quit."
He was silent for a long time.
She could feel the gears turning behind his eyes. He was reassessing, recalibrating. She had done more than just bandage his hand. In front of his men, she had restored order. She had taken control of a chaotic situation centered on his physical weakness and resolved it with quiet competence. She had not treated him like a broken toy. She had treated him like a patient. "From now on," he said, and his voice held a new authority that made all the men in the hall stand a little straighter, "you are no longer a maid. You will be my personal attendant. You will report only to me." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "You will stay by my side." It was not a request. It was a coronation. And as she looked into the depths of his dark eyes, Amelia knew that Marco had been right. The house was not safe, and she had just walked into the very center of the danger. But as she rose to her feet, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She had made a choice the moment she ran down those stairs. There was no going back. Therefore, her new life had begun. Her duties changed overnight. She no longer polished silver or dusted furniture. Her dark blue dress and apron were replaced by simple, conservative blouses and slacks. Her room in the staff quarters was exchanged for a suite of rooms adjoining Dante's own, with a connecting door he insisted remain unlocked. She was his shadow. Her days were structured around him. She helped him dress in the morning, her fingers brushing against the hard planes of his chest as she buttoned his shirts. The first time, her hands had trembled, but his stillness had calmed her. He showed no reaction, his face an unreadable mask, but she felt the subtle tensing of his muscles beneath her touch. She read to him financial reports, surveillance summaries, dossiers on his enemies. Her voice, calm and steady, filled the silence of his study for hours. He would watch her, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to more than just the words. He was learning the cadence of her speech, the rhythm of her breath. The most difficult part of her new role was the physical therapy. Twice a day, a gruff, barrel-chested therapist named George would come to the house. He would put Dante through a brutal regimen of exercises designed to maintain muscle tone and fight atrophy. It was an hour of sweat and strained grunts and thinly veiled agony. Dante hated it. He hated the dependency, the grunting effort, the way George had to manipulate his unresponsive legs. After the first week, he fired him. "I will not be manhandled like a piece of meat," he snarled, after throwing the therapist out. Amelia stood by the door, silent. "You'll do it," he said, turning his chair to face her. "I don't know how," she protested, her eyes wide. "I'm not a professional. You have eyes. You have hands." "You watched him for a week," he stated flatly. "I will show you the rest." And so she became his therapist. It was an intimacy that bordered on unbearable. Her hands on his legs, trying to knead life into muscles that would not fire. Her arms around his torso, supporting his dead weight as she helped him move from the chair to the therapy table. She saw the scars that littered his body, old wounds from a life of violence. A long, thin scar ran parallel to his spine, a reminder of the surgery that had failed to fix him. She felt the coiled power in his arms and chest, the frustration that radiated from him in palpable waves. During these sessions, he was at his most vulnerable and his most volatile. But he never lashed out at her. His pain was a shield, but sometimes she caught a glimpse of the man behind it. One afternoon, as she was stretching his leg, her hand slipped. To steady herself, She placed her other hand flat against his thigh. His entire body went rigid. She froze, her hand still on him. She could feel the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his sweatpants. She looked up and found him staring at her, his eyes dark and intense. The air crackled. It was the same charged energy she had felt in the foyer, but magnified 100 times. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling her hand away as if burned. "Don't be," he said, his voice a low rasp. And in that moment, she understood that her touch was not a clinical necessity to him. It was a reminder of a life he had lost, and perhaps a hint of one he had never known. The danger Marco had warned her of did not recede. It escalated. Rinaldi, emboldened by Dante's lack of public retaliation, grew bolder. One night, the perimeter alarm shrieked. Amelia's heart seized. She ran from her room into Dante's. He was already awake, his hand on the secure phone by his bed. "It's a breach. West Wall," he said, his voice calm and lethal. He was already giving orders to Marco. He hung up and looked at her.
Get dressed.
"Stay with me." Gunshots echoed from downstairs. Distant, muffled pops. Amelia's hands shook as she pulled on her clothes. He wheeled his chair to a large, ornate bookcase. He pressed a hidden button, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a steel door. A panic room. "In here," he commanded. The doorway was narrow. He could not get the chair through on his own. He tried, his wheels catching on the threshold. He swore a low, vicious sound. For the first time since she had known him, she saw a flicker of true helplessness in his eyes. She did not hesitate. She went behind him and pushed. Her shoulder pressed against his, her body straining with the effort. Together, they forced the chair over the lip and into the small, steel-lined room. She quickly pulled the heavy door shut behind them, plunging them into a dim, battery-powered light. The room was tiny, barely big enough for the chair and for her to stand beside it. The air was cool and still. The gunshots were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. She was trapped in a steel box with Dante Alighieri. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps. He reached out his good hand and, for the first time, touched her deliberately, his fingers closing around her wrist. "Breathe, Amelia," he said, his voice low and steady. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, a slow, calming motion. She looked at him, her eyes wide in the dim light. His face was inches from hers. She could see the faint lines around his eyes, the dark stubble on his jaw. The scent of him, sandalwood and steel, filled her senses. "They will handle it," he said. It was meant to be reassuring, but it was his touch that was doing the work, slowing her racing heart. "You couldn't get in," she whispered, the realization dawning on her. "Without me." His eyes held hers. The mask was gone. In its place was a raw, stark truth. "No," he said. "I could not." He did not let go of her wrist. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. The world outside, with its guns and its dangers, faded away. There was only the steel room, the dim light, and the warmth of his hand on her skin. It was a confession, more powerful than any words. He needed her. The threat was neutralized within the hour. Marco's men were ruthlessly efficient. When the all-clear was given, Dante finally released her wrist. The feeling of his touch lingered, a brand on her skin. As they emerged from the panic room, Marco met them in the hall, his face grim. It was Rinaldi's men. They got inside. Someone disabled the west wall sensors from the inside. He paused, his gaze shifting to Amelia for a fraction of a second before returning to Dante. It was Isabella's old security code. She must have given it to them. Dante's face hardened into stone. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. His wife had not just abandoned him. She had actively tried to have him killed. "Find her," Dante said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was the coldest, most terrifying sound Amelia had ever heard. In the aftermath of the attack, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted again. Amelia was no longer just an attendant. She was the one who had saved the boss, the one he trusted in the panic room. The guards looked at her with a new respect, tinged with fear. She was his. Life settled into a new, tense rhythm. Dante began to consolidate his power from the confines of his study. With Amelia as his hands and his voice, he reached out through his network, plugging the holes Isabella's betrayal had created. He was reasserting his reign, piece by piece. One evening, he was in a meeting with his capos, the heads of his crews. Amelia stood by the window, a silent observer, as was her custom now. The men were arguing over territory, their voices rising. Dante listened, his face impassive. One of the capos, a hot-headed man named Ricci, slammed his hand on the table. With all due respect, Dante, you are not on the street. You don't see what we see. Rinaldi is laughing at us. The room went silent. It was a direct challenge to his authority, made worse by the reference to his condition. Dante did not raise his voice. He simply let the silence stretch, his dark eyes fixed on Ricci. My eyes and ears are better than they have ever been, he said, his voice dangerously soft. He glanced at Amelia. Just a flicker of a look. But every man in the room saw it. I see everything. Ricci paled, understanding the unspoken message. Amelia was his eyes. To question what Dante saw was to question her. The challenge evaporated. The men mumbled their apologies, their gazes dropping to the table. Dante had used her presence to quell a rebellion without a single threat. She was a symbol of his new, more insidious form of power. Later that night, after the men had left, she was helping him with his therapy. The tension from the meeting still hung in the air. He was pushing himself harder than usual, his jaw tight with pain and effort. As she helped him transfer back to his chair, his arm slipped. He started to fall. Instinctively, she threw her body in front of his, bracing him, her arms wrapping around his chest to stop his descent. His dead weight pressed her against the chair. His face was buried in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. Her arms were locked around him, her hands splayed across the hard muscle of his back. For a long moment, neither of them moved. She was holding him up. Her heart was pounding, a frantic drum against his chest. She could feel the faint, desperate tremor in his body, the exhaustion of the fight. "I've got you," she whispered, the words instinctive, maternal. He lifted his head slowly. His face was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The air was thick, heavy, charged with a year of unspoken words, of shared pain and forced intimacy. "Amelia," he breathed, and the way he said her name was a prayer and a curse. He leaned in, and she knew he was going to kiss her. She knew she should pull away, that this was a line they could never uncross. But she did not move. She tilted her head, her eyes fluttering shut, and waited. The sound of a door slamming open shattered the moment. Marco burst into the room, his face ashen.
Dante.
"It's bad." Amelia scrambled back, her face flushed, her body trembling. Dante's expression was thunderous, a storm of fury directed at his underboss for the interruption. "This had better be worth your life, Marco," he snarled. "It's Isabella," Marco said, breathing heavily. "She's not with Rinaldi. She went to the feds. She's giving them everything. Your legitimate businesses, your accounts, names. She's trying to burn it all to the ground." The tension in the room changed from intimacy to ice. This was worse than a gang war. This was an existential threat. Isabella was not just trying to kill him. She was trying to erase him. Dante's face became a terrifyingly blank canvas. The man who had been about to kiss her was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating strategist. He looked at Amelia, and for a second, she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. He had almost let his guard down. The world had reminded him why he could not. "She thinks she can destroy me with paperwork," he said, a strange, cold smile touching his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "She forgets. I have a better accountant." His gaze settled on Amelia. It was not a look of love. It was a look of tactical assessment. She had read him, every report. She knew every number. She had become his memory. And in that moment, Amelia understood her final role. She was not just his nurse, his attendant, his eyes. She was about to become his weapon. She had thought the danger was a bullet. But the real war was about to be fought with ledgers and receipts, and she was on the front line. The federal investigation was a guillotine hanging over the Alighieri family. Isabella's betrayal was meticulous. She had provided documents, dates, and account numbers that painted a picture of racketeering and money laundering, all threaded through Dante's legitimate holdings. She had been the perfect corporate wife, and now she was using that knowledge to tear him down. Dante's study became a war room. Lawyers came and went, their faces grim. Marco and the Capos were on edge, the threat of prison far more terrifying than a street war with Rinaldi. Through it all, Dante was a pillar of unnatural calm. He had Amelia by his side constantly, her chair pulled up next to his wheelchair. "Read me the quarterly report for Adriatic Imports again," he would command at 3 a.m, his voice raw with exhaustion. And she would read, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. She read until her throat was hoarse and the numbers swam before her eyes. She had become the keeper of his secrets, the librarian of his empire. One night, as she was reading a dense file on a real estate holding company, she stopped. A single-line item from a report she had read weeks ago surfaced in her memory. "What is it?" Dante asked, his eyes sharp. "The Hamptons property," she said slowly, her mind racing. "The one Isabella redecorated last year. The invoices for the contractor. I remember them. They were astronomical. Over $2 million for a simple renovation. It was her pet project. I let her have her way," Dante said dismissively. "No," Amelia insisted, her voice gaining strength. "I remember thinking the payments were strange. They weren't made to a construction firm. They were made to a holding company. Icarus Ventures." Dante went still. "Icarus Ventures is one of Rinaldi's shells. We've been tracking it for months." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Isabella hadn't just started colluding with Rinaldi after the accident. She had been working with him for over a year. The renovation was a front. She had been siphoning Dante's money directly to his enemy, long before his wife's loyalty was ever tested by his paralysis. The accident wasn't the cause of her betrayal. It was just an opportunity. "Find the invoices," Dante commanded, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Find every single one." For 2 days, Amelia did not sleep. She lived in the mansion's cavernous records room, surrounded by boxes of files. With 2 of Dante's most trusted men, she dug through a mountain of paperwork. Finally, in a mislabeled box from a storage unit Isabella had controlled, she found it. A complete set of fabricated invoices from Icarus Ventures, and nestled within them, the original, much smaller, legitimate invoices from the actual contractor. And most damning of all, a signed wire transfer authorization, personally approved by Isabella, for a sum that was 10 times the actual cost of the work. It was the smoking gun. Proof that Isabella had not only committed fraud, but had been in league with a rival family. It was enough to discredit her entire testimony with the federal prosecutors. It was enough to put her in prison for a very, very long time. Amelia brought the file to Dante in his study. She laid the papers out on his desk, her hands steady. He examined them in silence, his expression unreadable. When he was done, he looked up, not at the papers, but at her. "She thought my weakness was my legs," he said, his voice quiet. "She never realized my strength was my memory." He reached out and touched the file. "And you are my memory now, Amelia." The legal battle was swift and brutal. Armed with the evidence Amelia had found, Dante's lawyers didn't just dismantle the federal case. They turned it back on Isabella. Faced with irrefutable proof of conspiracy and fraud, her immunity deal collapsed. The last Amelia heard, Isabella was facing a decade in federal prison. The Rinaldi family, exposed and weakened, was systematically absorbed by Dante's organization. He had not just survived. He had won. Utterly. In the quiet aftermath, the mansion seemed to breathe again. The tension was gone, replaced by the heavy calm of absolute victory. One evening, Dante summoned Amelia to the study. He was by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. She stood before him, waiting. She was no longer a maid in a blue dress, nor was she just an attendant. She did not know what she was. He turned his chair to face her. He held out his hand. She placed hers in it. He looked down at her fingers, at the faint calluses from her work. His thumb traced the lines on her palm. When I was in that car, watching the world burn, I thought I had lost everything, he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual armor. My legs. My power. My wife. He gave a short, bitter laugh. I was wrong about what was valuable. I was wrong about what was strong. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. His kiss was not passionate. It was reverent, a mark of fealty. These hands, he whispered against her skin. They cleaned up my messes. They bandaged my wounds. They found the weapon that saved my life. They are the most valuable thing I own. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw no walls in his eyes. There was no calculation, no strategy. There was only a vast, terrifying honesty. Isabella left a king and saw a cripple. You stayed with a cripple, and you reminded him how to be a king. He pulled her closer, until she was standing between his knees, her hands still held in his. I cannot give you a normal life, Amelia. I cannot give you walks on the beach or a house with a white picket fence. I can only give you this. He gestured around the opulent, silent room. A kingdom. And a throne, right here, beside mine. She looked down at the powerful man who was, in so many ways, completely at her mercy. She had seen his rage, his pain, his humiliation, and his triumph. She had saved his life, and in doing so, had irrevocably tied her own to his. Her old life was a ghost, a memory of a girl she no longer was. She did not need a white picket fence. She had never been that girl. She leaned down and placed a soft kiss on his forehead. It was her answer.
Her vow.
He closed his eyes, a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaping him. He was still a man in a wheelchair, a prisoner in his own body. But as he sat there, her hand in his, in the heart of his silent, conquered kingdom, Dante Alighieri was not a prisoner. He was enthroned. And Amelia was not his maid, or his nurse, or his memory. She was his queen.